The UK electricity market is riddled with inefficiencies, which means that UK households and businesses are constantly overpaying for our electricity. Even when we use electricity generated by cheap wind farms, we end up paying the price as if it had been generated by a natural gas power station due to the very archaic pricing structure that our electricity market follows. We also have to pay at times for wind farms to close down while the wind is blowing because we don't have the grid capacity to move the electricity from where it's produced to where it's needed. And therefore, we as customers end up paying twice. We have to pay for the wind farm to be shut down and not produce electricity while it's windy. And then we have to pay to fire up a natural gas power station to then generate the electricity that we need. So sometimes we're paying twice for our electricity. Wind farm operators are perversely motivated to build wind farms in the wrong place. Both the Conservative and Labour governments have actually incentivized wind farm operators to build wind farms where there's very, very low demand and poor connectivity. Therefore, the grid doesn't have the capacity or the cabling to transport the electricity from where it's generated in Scotland to where it's needed in England. And so the business model is actually that these wind farms get built there and earn more money by being paid to switch off and not produce electricity while the wind is blowing, instead of being motivated to produce electricity and reduce our carbon emissions. Over the course of the last 25 years, the amount of electricity we use generated by renewables has gone up from 3% to 42%. Meanwhile, the amount of electricity we use generated by fossil fuels has fallen from 73% to 41%. Therefore, in 2024, it was the first year in the UK where the amount of electricity we used generated by renewables was greater than the amount of electricity generated by fossil fuels. So how come this cheap renewable electricity is still so expensive? Let's take the electricity market and divide it up into three main agents. Firstly, we have the generators. Think of wind farms, solar farms, nuclear power stations. Next, we have electricity suppliers. These are companies such as Octopus Energy and EDF who provide us with electricity. And thirdly, we have the end users, households and businesses. Now, a huge determining factor in the price that we as consumers pay is the wholesale market for electricity. That is the price that the generators sell to the electricity suppliers. Generators sell to electricity suppliers in three ways. Firstly, they have bilateral contracts. Secondly, they're a transaction on the spot market. And thirdly, contracts for difference. Bilateral trades, it's very simply put, are transactions made hugely ahead of time. This is basically where the electricity supplier buys their base load, i.e. the minimum amount which they know that they're definitely going to need, and then they set the price ahead of time. Spot market transactions occur due to the fact that electricity cannot be stored, and you don't know your demand ahead of time, so therefore every half an hour during the day an auction is held whereby generators bid the price that they're willing to accept for units of electricity, and then the electricity suppliers accept those bids according to what their demand is. The issue for consumers is that for all the units that are purchased, the electricity supplier has to pay the price of the highest price unit for all the units. Let's take an example. Let's say for one auction, an electricity supplier needs 100 megawatt hours of electricity. They firstly receive a bid from a wind power station that offers them 40 megawatt hours of electricity for £60 per unit. They accept this bid. They then accept a bid from a nuclear power station, offering them 20 megawatt hours at £90 per megawatt hour. And then finally, they get a bid from a gas-fired powered station for 40 megawatt hours, costing £120 per megawatt hour. They now can fulfill their 100 megawatt hours, but they have to pay £120 per megawatt hours to all generators, the wind farm, the nuclear power station, and the gas-powered station. Therefore, with marginal cost pricing, you see that even if we increase the amount of renewable energy that we're using, we're still paying the price of natural gas, and we're tied to the natural gas market. As long as there's any natural gas in that mix, in that auction, to balance the grid, we end up paying the price of natural gas. Of course, the electricity suppliers are bound by this, and they then have to pass that cost onto the households. The spot market takes account of about 30% of transactions between the generators and the electricity suppliers, and reports are that 98% of the time there is some element of natural gas involved in the mix, which means 98% of the time, even if you're using a lot of cheap renewable energy, you still pay the price of natural gas. Imagine other essentials were priced in the same way as electricity. Now here I have my weekly food shop. So I have 4 bottles of water, 2 bottles of tonic, and 4 bottles of spirits. Can you imagine if 30% of the time, when I went to the checkout at the supermarket, they charged me the price of the most expensive spirit for everything that I'm buying? There would be absolute outrage. Let's say, for example, I changed my diet slightly for a slightly healthier diet, and I replaced 2 bottles of spirits with another couple of bottles of water. I would still have to pay the price of the most expensive spirit for all units. In order to protect consumers from marginal cost pricing, the government introduced contracts for difference. Contracts for difference are long-term contracts between an electricity generator and a government with a predetermined strike price for every unit of electricity supplied. In theory, this sounds fantastic, because now electricity generators are given a fixed price and aren't able to charge the excessively high prices under marginal cost pricing. Unfortunately, there are some problems with contracts for difference. Under contracts for difference, the electricity generator is now motivated purely to maximize output and not profit. One issue with this is that then they're not motivated to invest in energy storage because they can't store excess capacity and then sell at a later time when demand is high and the prices are high. This lack of motivation to invest in energy storage has really hurt British consumers. In 2022, the UK wasted an estimated 3.4 terawatt hours of wind power. That would be enough to power 1 million homes for a year. Imagine how useful this would have been when natural gas prices reached their record high after Putin's second invasion of Ukraine. In 2023, the UK wasted roughly 4.3 terawatt hours of wind power. And in 2024, the UK wasted an astonishing 8.4 terawatt hours of wind power. This would have been enough to power 2 million homes for a year. The second problem with contracts for difference is that wind farm operators therefore insist on being paid for all electricity that they forecast they can supply, even if that electricity is not needed at a certain moment in time. This leads to constraint payments. When the grid is unable to transport the electricity from where it's being generated to where demand is, the generators are then asked to reduce their output. They then receive compensation for having to reduce their output. Put brutally, we have to pay wind farms to stop producing electricity when it's windy because there isn't enough grid or there isn't enough cabling to transport that electricity to where demand is. Now, in 2024, these constraint payments totaled £1.23 billion, which National Grid has to pay and are then passed on to us. In the first 3 months of 2025, constraint payments equaled £385 million. And so the constraint payments are currently running at around £100 million per month. That means that every month, £100 million is being added to our electricity bills just to compensate wind farms to switch off while the wind is blowing. The worst offender for constraint payments in 2024 was Seagreen Offshore Wind Farm. Seagreen Offshore Wind Farm has been operational since October 2023, so 2024 was its first full year in operation. And its estimates for revenue are as follows. £104 million earned for providing electricity which was sent to households. £198 million in constraint payments, and £65 million in premiums for reducing output. That's a whopping £263 million in compensation payments to be shut down while the wind is blowing, compared to £104 million for producing electricity which is supplied to households and businesses. Let's look at Viking Wind Farm, which received the third highest amount of constraint payments in 2024. Viking Wind Farm has only been operational since September 24. And if you look on its website, it says it's able to produce enough renewable energy to power 500,000 homes. Viking Wind Farm is located on Shetland. Shetland has a population of roughly 23,000 people. Why on earth have we allowed a wind farm to be built on a remote island with a population of 23,000 people that has the capacity to generate enough renewable energy for 500,000 homes? There's sadly a lot of evidence to suggest that new wind farms are being built on purpose where there is low demand and poor connectivity, so wind farm operators can earn a decent chunk of revenue just by being compensated to switch off while it's windy. My first recommendation is that we keep marginal cost pricing, but have separate spot markets for renewables and fossil fuels. This encourages wind farm operators to maximize their profits and also produce electricity as efficiently as possible. Both are things that we actually want them to do. But it then sets a cap on the price at which they can sell electricity, and that would be the price for the most expensive wind farm operator rather than the price of natural gas. Maybe couple this with some regulation from Ofgem as to what the maximum price could be, and then immediately we, the British public, households and businesses, would actually see benefits of the fact that we've been reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and increasing the amount of electricity we use which is generated by renewables. Secondly, we need to immediately invest in energy storage systems for all the worst wind farms in Scotland that are driving up these constraint payments. Why on earth this wasn't Ed Miliband's first course of action, I do not know. Instead, what he thought was a top priority was in September 2024 to hold another bidding round for renewable projects, AR6, and approve for another 18 wind farms to be built in Scotland. Thirdly, we need to join the Scottish Rebellion. Sometime, a small amount of people, groups such as Scotland Against Spin, have been protesting against the wind strategy. Firstly, we shouldn't be building wind farms in Scotland because wind farm operators are clearly purposely building wind farms where there's low demand and poor connectivity. And now, of course, the only solution against that is to build a whole load of pylons and cables so that we can then transport that electricity from Scotland to England. However, the estimated costs of this are £108 billion, and they won't be ready until 2029. And of course, in Ed Miliband's recent auction round, these 18 new wind farms that he approved to be built in Scotland, they're all due to be built by 2028. So you can see that the British public are in trouble any way we look. We'll either see our curtailment costs going up hugely, which then we suffer and they get put onto our bills, or we have to spend a load more money on pylons and cables in order for these curtailment payments to be reduced so that that electricity can be transported to England. Either way, from the current policy, it's a lose for the British public. Why doesn't he tell the truth? That the reason that our electricity bills have been going up are due to marginal cost pricing and also the horrendous abuse of contracts for difference. It's not actually due to our dependence on fossil fuels, because as you've heard in this video, our dependency on fossil fuels is reduced hugely. We need to come up with an energy strategy which mixes all possible sources. So for example, when it comes to solar, don't build new solar fields, but do try and put solar panels on existing buildings such as schools, hospitals, etc. I spoke to a friend recently who runs a cafe, and he installed solar panels on his cafe, and within 3 years, that has completely paid for itself, and it was a worthwhile investment. When we look at Europe, France is a net exporter of energy. In response to the 1973 oil crisis, they came up with the Mesmer Plan. The Mesmer Plan basically led to, between 1975 and 1990, France building 52 nuclear reactors around the country. Now, what the French did tremendously well was all of these 52 reactors basically had one of 3 designs. So they did an initial 3 plants, and then they just rolled this out. With this standardization, it meant that for all plants coming onto the build plan, they could budget decently and estimate costs. This, of course, is sadly totally opposite to the UK, where we seem to start everything from scratch and then go disgustingly over budget, like we've done with Hinkley Point, HS2, and I could go on. However, we also need to mix this with a clear industrial strategy. So, for example, if we were to say our centres for manufacturing are going to be the northeast of England, the Midlands, and South Wales, then we could build wind farms or also other generators in those areas, ensuring that our manufacturing hubs had access to really, really cheap electricity. For me, it's really important that as many people in the UK as possible know the details of why our electricity bills are so high. So if you are disgusted by what you heard, but think this content is really, really good and people need to know about it, then please forward this video on to as many friends of yours as possible and click like and subscribe.